breaking news.
We continue on this Friday afternoon. I'm Brooke Baldwin. You're watching CNN. Thank you for being here. It appears that the revolving door at the Trump White House is swinging once again this Friday. The latest person who could be on the way out, Dan Coats, the director of national intelligence, who angered President Trump after contradicting him publicly during a congressional hearing earlier this year. Whether Coats ultimately stays or goes is to be determined, as this is not the first time the president has considered making this move. But there's also Alex Acosta, the labor secretary, who in 2008, as the U.S. attorney for the Southern District in Florida, played a key role in brokering that sweetheart deal for Jeffrey Epstein, who was accused of sexual abuse of underage girls. Today, after days of scrutiny and controversy and a very public attempt to defend himself, Acosta called it quits.
I called the president this morning. I told him that I thought the right thing was to step aside. Cabinet positions are temporary trusts. It would be selfish for me to stay in this position and continue talking about a case that's 12 years old rather than about the amazing economy we have right now. And so I submitted my resignation to the president effective 7 days from today, effective 1 week from today, earlier this morning.
CNN Chief White House Correspondent Jim Acosta is with me. And Jim, the president was standing right next to Alex Acosta when he quit, saying he didn't have to do this, declaring, "I'm with him." But if the president truly backed Alex Acosta, wouldn't he still be working at the White House? Or as a Commerce Secretary?
Yeah, I mean, it sure sounded earlier this week, Brooke.
Labor Secretary?
Labor Secretary, exactly. It sounded earlier this week, Brooke, that the president was going to have Acosta's back. He was saying in the Oval Office that he's been a fantastic labor secretary and so on. And then Alex Acosta went out in front of the cameras and tried to explain himself in terms of the Jeffrey Epstein saga. And according to officials initially, it sounded as though Acosta had stabilized things, but as time was going on later on in the week, my understanding is from talking to a senior White House official, is that the president started to stew over Acosta's fate and wondering, along with other officials inside the White House, whether or not he was just going to be too much of a burden and a distraction. And Brooke, I will tell you, one of the considerations that was coming into play as they were thinking about this internally, doing their deliberations, was how this was going to play out in the 2020 election, and having Acosta on whether or not he was just going to continue to be damaged goods for the administration. And I think that played a part in all of this. You heard the president say, well, we just did this morning. I talked to Alex Acosta this morning, and then we came out in front of the cameras like the boardroom on The Apprentice or something like that. But our understanding from talking to sources is that some of this was falling apart yesterday, Brooke.
What about Dan Coats? I know sources say he's looking to go back into retirement, but again, as we mentioned, this isn't the first time President Trump has thought about replacing him. So why is this coming up again?
Right, and we've talked about Dan Coats before. The president and Dan Coats have clashed at times. Dan Coats has gone rogue in terms of giving his own assessment of things when it comes to the Russia investigation and so on. And that has irked the president from time to time, and he's grumbled about Dan Coats for a good while. But from what we understand, talking to our sources, is that these discussions have picked back up again. I talked to a senior White House official earlier this morning who said, listen, Dan Coats has been in this position for 2.5 years. He's thinking about retirement again. Whenever senior White House officials are talking about high-level positions in the federal government in this fashion, that means that these kinds of talks are underway. The question is whether or not the president can find somebody who would be palatable up on Capitol Hill. Dan Coats is widely respected in Washington, as you know, Brooke. But at the same time, as we've been discussing all day long, the president and Coats just do not see eye to eye when it comes to some of these matters like Russian meddling and how the federal government has responded to all of that. You'll recall it was not that long ago that Dan Coats was issuing this warning to the public that the lights are blinking red inside the intelligence community about Russian interference. He's very concerned that the Russians are going to try this again. And when you talk to the president, when you hear from the president, we press him on this from time to time, he just does not share the same level of concern, doesn't express it publicly as Dan Coats does. So they've never really been on the same page. And it sounds as though I talked to a source close to the president earlier this morning who said the president is just deeply frustrated with Dan Coats. So this may be coming down the pike soon, Brooke.
Yeah, that red light blinking line. I remember we talked about this before. That did not go well with President Trump. Jim Acosta, Keep your eyes and ears peeled on that for us, please, sir. Thank you very much. And back to the Labor Secretary, Alex Acosta. Obviously, this is just the latest, individual to join this growing list of Trump administration departures over the past 2.5 years. You look at all these faces and you kind of have to squint. There are so many on the screen. I mean, as of the end of June, 8 confirmed cabinet officials have left office, and that doesn't include Acosta. All told, there are 260 vacant key leadership positions that include 61 at the State Department, 12 within Defense Department, and 15 within Department of Justice. Never mind the fact that key posts are still being filled only in the acting capacity, including acting Defense Secretary Mark Esper, DHS acting Secretary Kevin McAleenan, and acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. President Trump has said having officials in the acting capacity gives him much more flexibility, is his word, makes it a lot easier to do things, but acting officials may have a lot less authority within their agency and a harder time enacting policies. Daniel Dale is a CNN reporter. Michael Zeldin is a former federal prosecutor and a CNN legal analyst, and he was also a special assistant to Robert Mueller over at DOJ. So, gentlemen, happy Friday. Thanks for being on with me. And Daniel, let me go to you first, because I just want to get your reaction. We just threw all those faces up on the screen, right? All these vacancies in the White House. 14 cabinet level officials have left since Trump took office. Your reaction?
Well, it speaks to the nature of this president's personality. You know that in his business career, in his personal life, with his marriages even, there has been churn there. He wants things done his way. He is hard to deal with in many cases. And people have trouble dealing with that. I think it also speaks to Trump's willingness to allow people to leave so he can have the benefit of having acting officials. He said on numerous occasions he likes the flexibility that he gets without having people in there who have Senate confirmation. There are people who say that this is essentially a violation of the Constitution, of his duty to get people confirmed by the Senate. He doesn't care. He likes it, and he's going to continue doing it.
CNN has learned that one reason Acosta is leaving is because President Trump was concerned about more revelations going into the 2020 campaign. That's what Jim Acosta was also just reporting out, potential legal problems, Michael. So realistically, legally speaking, does Alex Acosta face any?
I don't think so. I don't think there's any personal jeopardy that could attach to Acosta this many years later. What really should happen, though, is that Attorney General Barr should be as public in his announcement about wanting to find out what happened here, why the U.S. Attorney's Office appears to have blinked in the face of the allegations against Epstein, so that we can make sure that this doesn't happen again. Remember, Acosta came to the U.S. Attorney's Office position as a Bush appointee with really no prior criminal law experience. And that's really a prescription for failure in the U.S. Attorney's Office, when the chief doesn't really have the expertise to deal with what will come his way. And that's what we see here.
What about, Daniel, pivoting just to the Justice Department and Attorney General Bill Barr, who said this yesterday after the president announced he would not push to add that citizenship question to the census? Here he was.
Thank you, Mr. President, and congratulations on today's executive order. I applaud the President for recognizing in his executive order that including a question on the census is not the only way to obtain this vital information. Congratulations again, Mr. President, on taking this effective action.
So, Daniel, on that congratulations piece, you fact-check me. The president boasted about how he was going to fight to get that citizenship question on the census, and now he's doing this total reversal. And you tell me why the AG is congratulating him.
He is. Well, I think he's congratulating him because he knows that in this administration you have to present every defeat, even the most obvious of defeats, as a victory. We saw this with the midterm election, for example, where Trump said, look, we won the Senate. We're actually the great champion here. And so this is like, to me, it's like having a boxer, getting pummeled. He's lying on the mat, and then his corner man comes over and says, congratulations, you won, when he just got knocked out. The option that Trump chose with this executive order was precisely the option that the Census Bureau presented to him before he launched into this fight. We have a memo that shows that in early 2018, the Census Bureau told Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, that they could get this information from government data without all the trouble of trying to put it on the census. Ross rejected that option. Trump rejected that option. Now they've chosen that option, and and Barr is congratulating Trump for belatedly choosing the option.
And also on the congratulating, just staying with you, hearing Barr applauding the president going around a Supreme Court ruling. Isn't that startling? Because that doesn't sound very impartial.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's not for me to say as a reporter how troubling it is, but that's certainly something we've heard from critics of the administration, that, Attorney General Barr is not playing the neutral sort of arbiter of the law role that he's supposed to play, that he's siding with the president, that he's executing the president's view regardless of what the law says. And this is more fodder for those critics.
Michael, how about you answer that one?
Okay, so the Attorney General did acknowledge that the Supreme Court has prevented them from moving forward with the citizenship question if the explanation for it is to enforce the Voting Rights Act, which has been the administration's position since April of 2018. So he acknowledged that argument won't be, availing in the Supreme Court. He did, though, say, I think we could have had better arguments if I were here, essentially, but I wasn't. And so what we're going to do is what the Census Bureau has always said from the beginning, is you have all the data, go aggregate it and analyze it and use it as is legally appropriate. So I don't think he was thumbing his nose at the Supreme Court. He really was sort of casting shade, as you say, on Wilbur Ross. But the thing that is important, I think, and again in the oversight hearings, the Commerce Department took the position, which the court said was contemptible, that this was to enforce the Voting Rights Act and that the Justice Department had asked for that. Barr has to find out, how did that happen? How is it that the Justice Department was used to create this phony argument for Voting Rights Act protection in order to get the citizenship question on the census when they knew that the outcome of that was going to be suppression of the count of Hispanic votes? That's what Barr should be focused on. How did that happen, and what can I do to prevent it?
Quickly, Michael, just on your former boss, Robert Mueller. He was supposed to testify at that congressional hearing next Wednesday. Instead, we're hearing it maybe delayed a week to allow for extended testimony on his Russia report. As of now, he was supposed to do those back-to-back sessions, but that wouldn't allow all lawmakers to actually question him. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that one day for Robert Mueller and two committees was ill-considered from the outset. That Mueller really needs to be there for one full day at least before each committee. There's just too much stuff in in his two-part report to go through. I sent notes around this morning. Here are the key conclusions from the Mueller report. That lasted 12 pages before I could get to the end of it. It's just too much stuff. You'll never get what you want out of this in such a short, truncated hearing. So I'm hopeful that they'll actually do it the following week over a 2-day period so we can hear what Mueller has to say.
Okay. Michael Zeldin, Daniel Dale, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thanks, Brooke. Thank you.
Hasn't been in office for months now, but former Speaker Paul Ryan is drawing the ire of President Trump today. We'll tell you why. And Tropical Storm Barry gaining strength and threatening to flood the Gulf. We are live in New Orleans. Fear and panic. President Trump backed up reports that ICE will execute raids starting in 2 days in these major cities and others. An immigration official says agents will target undocumented immigrants with deportation orders. And the president said in that group that criminals will be the focus.
Nothing to be secret about. If the word gets out, it gets out. It starts on Sunday, and they're going to take people out, and they're going to bring them back to their countries, or they're going to take criminals out, put them in prison, or put them in prison in the countries they came from. We're focused on criminals as much as we can before we do anything else. So we are really specifically looking for bad players, but we're also looking for people that came into our country, not through a process. They just walked over a line. They have to leave.
Democrats and migrant advocates are putting all undocumented people on alert about their rights. They're giving them some advice, and city officials have sounded the alarm about the distress gripping so many in their community. Listen to the Houston police chief.
There's a lot of fear across our immigrant community, and we're not one of the most diverse. We're the most diverse city in the nation, and so there's great fear amongst our immigrant community as to what's going to happen. I've had children come up to me at forums saying, I'm afraid to go to school, I'm afraid to leave the house, I'm afraid to come home and find that my parents are gone. And these are American children, U.S.-born children, so it's creating havoc in our community.
Let's go to El Paso to my colleague Ed Lavandera. And Ed, you tell me what you've been seeing. Are people not showing up to work? Are kids staying indoors? What's the story there?
Well, that's going to be a real question that we see this weekend, exactly how undocumented immigrant communities across the country, and not just undocumented immigrant communities, but immigrant communities overall, how they're going to react to this. We have heard anecdotally that people are preparing for this as if it were some sort of a hurricane storm approaching, gathering up on food and water and supplies, because they don't plan on leaving their homes for the next several days as they wait this out. So just how far-reaching the effects of all this will be, but it's clear that the fear and the anxiety is cutting deep through many of these communities.
You've done so much reporting on this very issue. You have a huge special specifically dedicated to immigrants and immigration. Tell me about it.
Well, it's called The Hidden Workforce, and we really take a look at exploring the lives of undocumented immigrants here in the United States. As you well know, the debate around immigration in this country has really reached kind of toxic levels, and it's really hard to have a serious discussion. It's much more complicated than the talking points you hear many pundits kind of shouting at each other over this issue. It's an issue that is extremely complicated, that deserves a much more deeper and thoughtful approach. And we have an hour kind of exploring just how deeply embedded, whether people like it or not, how deeply embedded undocumented immigrant communities are embedded into the fabric of American society. And part of that journey took us to Minnesota. You can see a little bit of what we found there.
You've made St. Mary's a sanctuary church.
It was a week after the election of President Trump. You could feel the fear within the community.
And that hasn't changed?
No. We have mental health issues. People are suffering from depression. We have a rise in alcoholism, drug addiction, abuse, and domestic violence. And it's all as a result of what's taking place within our country.
What do you say to those people who say, you know what, all these undocumented immigrants in places like Worthington, they need to round them up and get them out of here? What would that do to a place like Worthington?
If all the immigrants were to leave tomorrow, this town would die.
What percentage of these farms and these agricultural businesses around here, what percentage of undocumented workforce do they depend on?
I would say probably 90%.
That's an astounding number.
It is.
So, Brooke, I think if you watch news coverage of immigration issues over the last year or so, people are used to seeing undocumented immigrants here on the border where we are, but we're really going to take you in this hour to places in other parts of the country where you're least likely to expect and kind of be overwhelmed and shocked by just how deeply embedded many of these people are in communities in the least likely of places. Brooke?
We will be tuning in. Again, it is called The Hidden Workforce. It airs tonight, 10 o'clock Eastern, right here on CNN. Ed Lavandera, thank you so much for your work on this. Coming up, the president unleashes on the former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, after Ryan accuses him of not knowing a thing about government. But we're asking, where was Ryan's criticism when he was Speaker? And an unsettling warning from Trump's Treasury Secretary: the U.S. government is running out of cash a lot faster than expected. Is considering replacing Dan Coats, his Director of National Intelligence. And David Axelrod is a former senior advisor to President Obama and host of the Axe Files here on CNN. And David, we've spoken about this in the past. It's sort of somehow come back, right? The notion of his potential departure. What do you make of this and that just the revolving door that is this White House?
Well, first of all, this is not a bastion of job security. We know that. There's been tons of turnover. And Dan Coats has been the subject of a lot of speculation for quite some time, in part because he's fulfilled his obligation to his oath and to be honest about what he sees and what he hears. Now, there was a piece in the Post today, I think, that was recounting the anniversary of the whole calamitous week in which the president stood next to Putin and essentially in Helsinki and essentially threw the intelligence community under the bus and took Putin's word on the election meddling. And that same week, Coats was in Aspen and was being interviewed and was told that the president had invited Putin to Washington, and he was stunned because he hadn't heard that news, and he just said, well, that'll be special. And there was this huge, yeah, exactly. And so, and that, I don't know whether the president read that this morning, and that kindled his fire again. But he's been after this guy for a long time, so it wouldn't be surprising if he removed him because he doesn't think he's loyal to him first.
I've got more for you. Let me set this next one up. Because President Trump also unloaded today on the former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, the tongue lashing in response to excerpts now coming out from this new book where the former Wisconsin Republican takes a few parting shots at Trump. This is an example of what set the president off. Let me quote this for you. So in this new book, it's called American Carnage by Tim Alberta. Paul Ryan is quoted as saying this about Trump. Quote, "I told myself I got to have a relationship with this guy to help him get his mind right because I'm telling you, he didn't know anything about government. I wanted to scold him all the time," end quote. Needless to say, the president not really loving the criticism.
Paul Ryan was not a talent. He wasn't a leader. Paul Ryan was a lame duck for a long time as Speaker. He was unable to raise money. He lost control of the House. The only success Paul Ryan had was the time that he was with me because we got taxes cut. Frankly, he was a baby. He didn't know what the hell he was doing.
So, David, obviously we're not surprised how the president's reacting to this, but my question to you really is, aside from Justin Amash or maybe Mitt Romney, this once again follows this pattern of a Republican speaking up, right, criticizing this president either as they're on their way out of office or as they're already out of office, when they're finally speaking their mind.
Yeah, this isn't exactly parting shots. This is parted shots, and he obviously gave this interview because he wanted to unburden himself. They have had a very trying relationship from even before the president's election. You'll remember during the 2016 campaign, at one point, Ryan suggested one of the comments of the president's was racist. By the end of the campaign, after the Access Hollywood incident, or disclosure, he separated himself from Trump. And so they have not had a good relationship historically, but it's not surprising to see the president react this way. He's getting the same treatment the British ambassador and countless others have. One thing we know for sure, that if you in any way insult the president, he will come back and insult you with a fury. And we see it again today. It's like
unless you're a dictator.
Right. Then you can get away with quite a bit.
Right. Let's talk about you. Let's talk about the Axe Files. You sat down with South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Here's a clip.
Yeah. I thought you did a fine job in those debates, but you didn't get the headline because you didn't throw the punch.
I think people right now are looking for a president who is steady. Now, I am a competitive person. This is a fierce contest, and I will be competitive with my Democratic competitors, just as I plan to be fiercely competitive with the president when the time comes to take him on. But I think some of the made-for-television moments can give you a little spike and then wear off. What people really want to know is, what are you about?
So what was your impression of the mayor, and what do you think he needs to do on that debate stage in Detroit, the one that CNN's hosting in a couple weeks?
Well, he talks about made-for-TV moments, but the debates are on TV. So if you want to be heard or seen, you generally have to push off of something. He did have a fine debate, and he does make a great presentation. But he's very even, and there aren't a lot of moments of drama there, and that may actually benefit him, or it would if he were the nominee of the party running against Donald Trump. I think people may be looking for the antidote to Trump. But while you're competing for the nomination and you're trying to define your differences with others on that stage, you have to find ways to do it that are memorable, and I think that's something he'll be thinking about going into the next debate.
David Axelrod, always a pleasure, and let's tell everyone where to
Good
go.
To see you, Brooke. Have a great weekend.
Watch. Thank you. You too. You can watch the whole interview with Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Brand new episode of the Axe Files airs tomorrow night at 7 o'clock right here on CNN. Administration. Sources tell CNN that Dan Coats, the director of national intelligence, who has been the subject of the president's anger in the past, could be replaced. This is something the president has considered before, but it is still unknown if he will make a move at this time. This is coming on this day as Labor Secretary Alex Acosta is heading for the exits. Just 2 days after defending his role in that 2008 sweetheart deal for a sexual abuse case involving multimillionaire Jeffrey Epstein, Acosta made the announcement just this morning over at the White House, standing right next to his soon-to-be former boss.
I called the president this morning. I told him that I thought the right thing was to step aside. Cabinet positions are temporary trusts. It would be selfish for me to stay in this position and continue talking about a case that's 12 years old rather than about the amazing economy we have right now. And so I submitted my resignation to the president, effective 7 days from today, effective 1 week from today, earlier this morning.
For his part, President Trump wanted everyone watching to know that Acosta's departure was not his idea.
I just want to let you know, this was him, not me, because I'm with him. He's a tremendous talent. He's a Hispanic man. He went to Harvard, a great student. And in so many ways, I just hate what he's saying now because we're going to miss him. This is a person that I've gotten to know. There hasn't been an ounce of controversy at the Department of Labor until this came up. And he's doing this not for himself. He's doing this for the administration. And Alex, I think you'll agree. I said, you don't have to do this. He doesn't have to do this.
CNN's Sarah Westwood is live in Milwaukee, where later today the president will tour an aerospace facility. And Sarah, Secretary Acosta becomes the 13th. Let me say that again. The 13th cabinet member to leave this Trump White House. We just heard the president say he is with Acosta and that he didn't have to quit. But behind the scenes, CNN has learned that Trump was expressing his doubts. You tell me what you know.
Plea deal that Jeffrey Epstein received in Florida some 10 years ago. Now, President Trump had gone from publicly praising Acosta and urging him to defend himself. In fact, it was President Trump who encouraged Acosta to give that press conference in the first place, to questioning why it was that victims in that Florida case were not notified of the deal that Epstein's defense team ultimately struck with the U.S. Attorney's Office under Acosta's leadership. Now, President Trump clearly saying today that it was Acosta's decision to resign, that Acosta was the one who said he didn't want to create any more distractions for this administration. But inside the White House, there were also concerns among White House officials that the rolling disclosures about Acosta's involvement in this deal, which have continued since scrutiny on the plea agreement has grown, first with that Miami Herald article and then with the new charges against Epstein, that would only continue to create distractions for this White House. So President Trump creating yet another vacancy in his cabinet by letting Acosta go, as Trump himself publicly distanced himself from that social relationship that he reportedly enjoyed with Jeffrey Epstein years ago. Brooke.
Well, let's back up just while I have you too on Director Coates. Why is he coming up again at a potential departure?
Well, Brooke, President Trump has been discussing with confidants yet again his frustration with his Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates. That's not new frustration. For months on and off, the president has questioned whether he has the right man in that job. Back in January, recall that Coates gave congressional testimony that contradicted what President Trump was saying publicly about Iran, about North Korea. President Trump was very angry at Coates over that at the time, and he did confide in confidants that he had perhaps considered replacing Coates at ODNI. But now sources tell CNN that President Trump is again calling up his aides, calling up his advisors, asking them if Coates should perhaps be replaced. And one name that he's floated is Fred Fleitz. That's the former Chief of Staff to National Security Advisor John Bolton as a potential replacement for Coates. Fleitz has had discussions with the White House about potentially taking that job. But Brooke, we know that President Trump, no stranger to creating a vacancy without having a permanent replacement in the pipeline. And we just don't know when or if the president will finally make his move on Coates.
Yeah. You got that, Sarah Westwood. Thank you very much. Let's discuss. Ellie Honig is with me, former assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, a former federal prosecutor, and a CNN legal analyst. And Nancy Ancrum is back with us today. She is the editorial page editor for the Miami Herald, which broke open the Epstein case massively last fall in this investigation series called Perversion of Justice. And the paper did a deep dive into Alex Acosta's work as the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida in a piece called How a Future Trump cabinet member Gave a Serial Sex Abuser the Deal of a Lifetime. So let's dive right into it. Ellie, starting with you. Obviously, Acosta did not survive the White House. legally speaking, what might this mean for him?
So I think Acosta's biggest concern now is the investigation that the Department of Justice is doing internally to look at the process of that plea agreement. And to me, he's got two big problems. Number one, the bottom line of that plea deal is just beyond anything you could ever explain as a prosecutor.
Yeah.
13 months. And just for comparison, I looked at a couple recent sex trafficking cases out of the Southern District of New York, which is now prosecuting Epstein, my former office. In one of them, the defendant got 30 years, and in another of them, 2 defendants got life sentences. So compare that to 13 months. I don't know if there's any way. But the bigger shadow that will loom is the secrecy. And we just heard about that. The fact that Acosta did not notify the victims and agreed to not notify the victims violated his right as a prosecutor, and I think that's going to haunt him for the rest of his career.
I want to come back to you on who else may have been in on this. But Nancy, the recurring theme from both Trump and Acosta, one that was repeated today. Let's listen.
He made a deal that people were happy with, and then 12 years later, they're not happy with it.
I have seen coverage of this case that is over 12 years old, that has input and vetting at multiple levels of Department of Justice. And as I look forward, I do not think it is right and fair for this administration's Labor Department to have Epstein as the focus.
Nancy, 12 years ago, we were talking about this when we were listening to Acosta, in the last day or so, and they seem to sort of brush it off. And I'm curious, with Julie Brown, who led your investigation at the paper, and other reporters on staff, is this the kind of attitude that your journalists encountered when they were digging into this?
Oh, absolutely. I think we have to realize when it comes to Acosta resigning, it was a matter of when and not if, especially after the arrest of Jeffrey Epstein on Saturday. And yes, I think that the cavalier attitude towards specifically the victims, we are talking about this because of the A-list names who are involved. But unfortunately, we know that women who allege sexual assault are ignored. We know that they are silenced. We know that often their rapists are proclaimed good boys by judges and given a light sentence. Unfortunately, this is nothing new.
I'm glad you said that, and you're 100% right on that, and the women and the victims. To you, Ellie, I had actually a whole conversation with a friend of mine over breakfast about the White House vetting process. When you look at what's happened here, and the fact that the plea deal that was arranged some years ago was so well known, where's the vetting? Yeah,
It's a systematic failure, and I think it's really hampering this White House. When you have so many people being knocked out of office one way or another at the top of these departments, you really compromise the ability to get your agenda done. And I think it continues to haunt this administration, and to not have dug fully into this on Acosta really jumps out, because you don't have to dig deep. It was all out there, it was all public, and yet they still put him through. And so, look, they bought this mess for themselves.
I just want to remind everyone, Acosta is the 13th cabinet member to depart, the 9th since a month ago, and there are some 260 vacancies or acting officials in the Trump administration. Those are the numbers for you. Nancy and Ellie, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
President Trump is just now jumping into someone else's battle. The back and forth between House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and freshman Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. What will it take to end this feud? Congresswoman Louis Frankel joins me live next. And ICE raids already under. We're watching CNN. Restrained press conference announcing the resignation of Labor Secretary Alex Acosta. The president taking the opportunity to lash out at his critics and rivals. But he also issued a surprising defense of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. The president accusing freshman Democrats like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar of being disrespectful, his word, to the speaker. This is coming after AOC accused Pelosi of unfairly singling out women of color for criticism.
I deal with Nancy Pelosi a lot, and we go back and forth, and it's fine. But I think that a group of people is being very disrespectful to her. I'm looking at this Omar from Minnesota, and if one half of the things they're saying about her are true, she shouldn't even be in office. But Cortez should treat Nancy Pelosi with respect. She should not be doing what she's doing. And I'll tell you something about Nancy Pelosi that you know better than I do. She is not a racist.
Let's start there. With me now, Congresswoman Liz Frankel. She's a Democrat from Florida, the chair of the Democratic Women's Working Group, and a member of the House Appropriations Committee. So, Congresswoman Frankel, a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. When you heard the president there actually defending Speaker Pelosi and attacking, your Democratic colleague, specifically saying Ilhan Omar, she shouldn't even be in office. Your response to the president?
Well, first, thank you for having me. I think I was laughing the whole time he was with those comments.
I thought I saw a smile on your face.
Well, talking about disrespect, this is a man who disrespects everyone. But as for our caucus, first of all, I just want to say the diversity of our caucus is terrific. But here's what we've been united on. We've passed legislation to reduce gun violence, to lower health care costs, to secure our elections. We've sent legislation that both Nancy Pelosi and AOC voted for, and the rest of us, over to the Senate. And if there's any disrespect, it's coming from Mitch McConnell, who is refusing to take up multiple good bills that we're sending to him.
But Congresswoman, back to the issue at hand. I mean, you're there on Capitol Hill. Do you think some of these women, do you think these freshman congresswomen have stepped over the line?
Again, I think the diversity is great. I think a lot of this feud is exaggerated. Maybe it's in the Twitter world because on the ground here, I feel like on the issues that are very important to the American public, Democrats are united.
But when you see the tweet from Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, referring to the Speaker of the House, that public, whatever is called public sentiment, wielding the power to shift is how we actually achieve meaningful change in this country. I mean, is Twitter really the right way to air your grievances with the Speaker of the House?
Well, I guess these younger members have a new way of communicating. I think it's.
Is that what we just chalk it up to?
But I think. Yes, I think it's preferable to have face-to-face communications, and I think that's happening now.
But Speaker Pelosi, I know, is calling for party unity. So how is all of this back and forth over Twitter and seeing now the president defending, the House Speaker? How is that helpful in unifying your party and working against this president?
Well, first of all, Nancy Pelosi does not need Donald Trump to defend her. And really, Nancy Pelosi is a very strong leader. And as I said before, we've been unified on very, very important legislation. And I think that's what is important. I personally love the diversity, and I don't mind a little mixing up. Because in the end, we work together to do the right thing for the American people.
Congresswoman Frankel, let me ask you about the big story of the day, the resignation of Labor Secretary Alex Acosta, who, by the way, is the 13th cabinet member to depart the Trump White House. We've talked so much about how there are all these acting officials. Well, what is the real impact of, you laugh, but it's true, 13th. What's the impact of these vacancies and acting positions, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's quite evident in the policy of this president, which is basically to say vile things about immigrants and do horrible things like separating children from their parents at the border, like trying to take away our health care by sending lawyers to the courts to try to throw out the Affordable Care Act. It's all reflected in his policy, all his promises, infrastructure, lowering health care costs. We haven't seen any evidence of that.
But to have a revolving door with this White House, when people are watching, who are counting the numbers of people leaving, why does that matter?
Well, it matters is because these agency heads or cabinet officials are supposed to lead their agencies. And what we can see is whatever's being done, to me, it's been very, very destructive. But I do want to say this. I am glad that Alex Acosta resigned, and it didn't happen soon enough. He's a person that shouldn't have been appointed in the first place, like several other of the cabinet appointments.
Okay. Congresswoman Frankel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right now, across the country, millions, she just mentioned immigration, millions of undocumented immigrants are watching and waiting. ICE raids are set to begin, and some activists are trying to help frightened families escape. I'll ask a former top ICE official what he is thinking about. ICE will execute raids starting in 2 days in these major cities. And an immigration official says agents will target undocumented immigrants with deportation orders. And the president said that in that group, criminals will be the focus.
Nothing to be secret about. If the word gets out, it gets out. It starts on Sunday, and they're going to take people out, and they're going to bring them back to their countries, or they're going to take criminals out, put them in prison, or put them in prison in the countries they came from. We're focused on criminals as much as we can before we do anything else. So we are really specifically looking for bad players, but we're also looking for people that came into our country, not through a process. They just walked over a line. They have to leave.
Democrats and migrant advocates are putting all undocumented people on alert about their rights, and city officials have sounded the alarm about the distress gripping many in their community. This is the Houston police chief.
There's a lot of fear across our immigrant community, and we're not one of the most diverse. We're the most diverse city in the nation, and so there's great fear amongst our immigrant community as to what's going to happen. I've had children come up to me at forums saying, "What? I'm afraid to go to school. I'm afraid to leave the house. I'm afraid to come home and find that my parents are gone." And these are American children, U.S.-born children. So it's creating havoc in our community.
With me now, Ron Vitello, former acting ICE director and chief of Border Patrol. So, Ron, thank you so much for being here, sir.
Great to be with you.
Tell me what concerns you most about this weekend's raids or enforcement, now that the word is out.
Well, we have to concern ourselves with the officers that'll conduct this operation. These we shouldn't call them raids because these are targeted events. The president did mention that it's going to be broader than just the family docket, which was sort of the original announcement before. But these are people who have gone through a due process. They came across the border. They were released at the border or later by ICE. They were noticed by the court to go through a due process, an asylum claim or immigration claim, and they refused to do that. They were subsequently noticed by the government again, ICE itself, to come in and report and get on an order of supervision so we would know who they were and then get them through the process. So they've had a couple of bites at the apple. They've been noticed to come into immigration court, and many of them refused to do that. And so now it's time for the loop to be closed. We talk often about immigration loopholes and how people are getting over on the system. This is a way for ICE, the administration, and the American public to know that we believe in the rule of law. These people had their chance. They didn't take it, and now there's going to be a consequence.
So the ACLU obviously sees it differently. They say that many of these people who were served removal orders were given them unfairly. Many were not told when their hearings were or given the wrong time or date. What's your response to that?
Well, they were noticed twice. So they were told at the border they had specific instructions to report. They were to report to the court so they have a valid address for them. Notices were given by the court itself. The judge made a decision. After that decision was rendered, ICE made a subsequent notice. And so here we are. They've been ordered through the process to be removed, and it's ICE's role to do that. Hopefully they do it safely and for everyone involved. But this is how you enforce the rule of law. If we're going to have a border, if we're going to have an immigration system with integrity, these operations need to occur.
How about the agents themselves? I was talking to a reporter from the New York Times yesterday, and in her reporting, she was talking to some of these agents, and they were telling her that they're apprehensive about, when they go to these homes and they find children and babies. And I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on that? What's your advice to the agents who will be the ones carrying this out?
As an agent myself, and you know what law enforcement does, the officers out there, they do their work with a definite level of compassion. They're going to treat everybody with dignity and respect. Nobody wants to go out and arrest children. That's not what this is about. What this is about is these people came across the border illegally. They were offered an opportunity at due process. Thousands of them did not take that opportunity. And now it's time for the consequence to be enacted. A judge reviewed their circumstances and ordered them removed. This is the end of that process.
And then just, I want to ask about you, because we know that, Ron, that the president pulled your nomination because he said he wanted someone tougher in the roles. This is, quote, Ron's a good man, but we're going in a tougher direction. We want to go in a tougher direction. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but do you approve of the rhetoric that he's using and the tactics here?
Well, I've been part of the administration, and we spent months and months on the Hill, in public, amongst ourselves, looking for ways to close these immigration loopholes that is driving this crushing surge at the border. This is one of the consequences for crossing the border illegally. You get removed when a judge reviews your case. And so I appreciate what the president said about me being a good guy. I understand what he meant, but I don't know what was in his head when he talked about a tougher direction. What I know is that the men and women of ICE, the professionals at the border and the Border Patrol, are doing everything they can to solve this problem and make these people comfortable and try to get out from under this crisis. But until Congress acts, we're going to have this surge at the border, and it's not going to stop until the framework of the law changes.
Ron Vitiello, thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you.
Tropical Storm Barry.